Happy to be here today at the GFOABC conference. As you can see from the first slide, so my topic is aligning asset management with climate change adaptation. And just to let you know, as I go through, there will be a question period at the end. So feel free to use the live chat button to put any questions into that live chat, and we'll address them towards the end of the presentation. Thank you. So the agenda that I'm going to go through, I'm going to talk about climate and weather impacts across Canada, just as a starting point. And then I'll get into the process of how do we align asset management with climate adaptation, two different disciplines, but how do we bring them together? Then we'll look at how do you develop an asset management program? What are the elements? And as you start to build those elements through the assessing, the planning, and the implementation stage, how do we also bring in climate considerations all the way through? And then finally, we'll finish just some benefits of asset management itself. So why do this at all? Well, you know, the key goal of asset management is on the screen there. So sustainable service delivery is the key objective of any asset management program. And one of the biggest threats or significant threats to sustainable delivery of any infrastructure service is climate change. So it just makes sense that we need to bring the climate lens into the asset management program right from the get-go. So if we look at the Canadian experience and how is the climate being affected, so you know we got to think of climate as two things. There's the slow inception of a changing climate that's happening gradually over time. But there's also, with that, a lot of weather variability and extreme weather events that have been happening. And as you get to the northern latitudes on the globe, the effects are more pronounced. So Canada is actually warming twice as much as the rest of the world, and that's been proven to date. And also, we're looking at the fact that an extreme weather event that used to be a once in 20-year event is now projected to be a once in every 5-year event by the end of the century under the high emission scenario. A once in 50-year event will become a once in 10-year event by the end of the century under the high emission scenario. So whatever scenario comes forward, things are gradually going to get worse, and we're going to get more extreme weather events more often. And already precipitation levels have increased 20% to the present day from 1948. So that's 1/5. So that's very significant as well. So how does this look if we look at the costs of these events? So this comes from the Bureau of Canadian Infrastructure. It's their data, and we're looking at some of the extreme weather events that have happened since 1983. And there's a clear trend that if we look at the loss and loss adjustment expenses, it's going significantly up to the present day. You can see the trend on the graph. A number of us will be aware of some of these extreme events that are actually listed. But more importantly, many of the bars on this graph, it's not just one event, it's the accumulation of localized extreme events right across Canada that are just starting to raise the picture right across. And in Western Canada, I looked up some statistics. So here we have it. So the temperature has increased between 1948 to 2016, so it's not quite up to date, by almost 2 degrees centigrade. So that's really significant, and it's projected to continue to increase by the turn of the next century by 5.2%. So that's huge. Precipitation change is a little old, the data here, but it wasn't a bad stat I found. Has gone up 5% since 1948 to 2012. And also very interestingly, it's 9% down in the winter months. And you guys will know in BC, there's areas of BC that have become very dry as well. And projected precipitation change up to the end of the century is huge, 14% change. That's going to be, really significant. And with that, likely to occur extreme events, things that are already happening but going to reoccur: droughts, wildfires, flooding, coastal erosion, of course, very important on the West Coast, heavy winds. So this is what we're going to see more of as we come forward. It's the new normal. So into the subject, how do we align asset management with climate change adaptation. And they're two separate disciplines, but there may be a way we can bring them together that's a little easier than what we might first think. And of course, asset management, climate adaptation, they're two key pieces of just planning for a sustainable community, which is the goal of most municipal governments today. So let's look at the process. If we look at the assessing, the planning, and the implementation process on both sides here. So as we go into asset management planning, we want to assess the management of an organization's infrastructure to an agreed level of service. If we look at the adaptation plan, it's not that different. Those folks want to assess the vulnerability of social or built environments, but also biological systems to current and future climate change. So a similar process, just a much wider spectrum. In the planning stage on asset management, we like to identify field needs and prioritize projects and project listings using risk and criticality models and cost-benefit analysis. And on the climate adaptation side, they identify needs and adaptation options using risk and criticality models and cost-benefit analysis. So all of a sudden, it's starting to sound very similar. And then ultimately, we implement key recommendations, but we also monitor progress through key performance indicators, review, and then we start again. And it's the same on both sides of the fence. So there's a lot of similarities where we can bring these two processes together. But before I show you how we do that, or an approach to do that, let's look at the types of climate change adaptation plan that are typically generated within a community, or within a municipality, sorry. So often there's the community plan. So this is very wide in spectrum. So the municipality will work with other community leaders, and they'll look at broad topics such as health, energy, food security, agriculture. And out of that plan, there'll be a lot of really good information and a lot of good recommendations on how to move forward. Another flavor of climate adaptation plan is the corporate plan. So this is still a municipal plan, but it's focused on the organization and the departments within the organization. So your health department, your community service department, your public works department, and there'll be some key recommendations on how do they bring climate adaptation forward. Both of these are so broad in spectrum, you get great recommendations, but it's not the type of thing that has a lot of teeth. It doesn't end up in an operations and maintenance budget. It doesn't end up in a capital budget. It's more leading the process to get there. And I've spoke to enough environmental folks and enough municipalities, and there's some frustration there that they want to get to the next level to actually make a difference in their community. And the answer is to move to a individual sector specific plan. So this is what a lot of folks are moving towards. One just on health, one just on agriculture. And obviously in the asset management space, it would be really good to see an adaptation plan dedicated to infrastructure alone. And then we can start to blend it with the asset management. And let's face it, these extreme weather events, one of the key areas that is always affected is infrastructure. So that's a key area to keep in mind. But moreover, let's look at a plan against a program. An adaptation plan is always a great start. And if you get to that industry-specific infrastructure plan, absolutely a great start. But a plan typically has finite timelines. It's a snapshot in time when the data was available. And it's much better to blend the approach into the internal programs of the municipality. And what I put in the bullet is a program instead will achieve a set of enduring behaviors and practices that continue on into the future. If you can blend things into a program, you're actually changing the internal culture. You're changing the internal business philosophy, and that will stay with you throughout time. So if you started asset management within your municipality, you already have a program in place that has a great framework that you can bring climate considerations into. And that will become part of that philosophy and the practices of that program going forward. And I think it's the better approach. So on that, what is in a typical asset management program? And there's a lot of information here, But I'm going to talk about, this is how you would do the typical asset management development, whether you were looking at the road network or the wastewater networks or your portfolio of facilities within a municipality. You would look at some key elements as you go through the assessment, the planning, and the implementation stage. And each one of the items that's bolded, I have slides following on each one of these in a bit more detail, where I'll actually discuss how do we bring in climate considerations as well. So most people start their asset management process with a policy. That's where you get endorsement from senior management, ultimately from council. Then you look at the governance structure, the folks involved, the roles and responsibilities of those folks, who should be at the table. And then a lot of people typically do a current state assessment. It's called an asset management strategy. Where are we at today? What gaps do we have to get the best practice? And what initiatives do we put in place to close those gaps? In the planning stage, typically you look at your data, what data is in place, what gaps do we have? Then you move towards gathering condition data from the field, so you can truly manage the assets by measuring their condition today. And then you look at some more sophisticated asset management processes. How do I prioritize my projects through risk management? How do I prioritize my projects through good lifecycle management? And how does all of that allow me to quantify what level of service I can achieve in my community? And then finally, you execute that through your asset management plans, more importantly, through your long and short-term budgets, and you monitor your level of service by benchmarking and having some key performance metrics around that. But all the way along, you're communicating all the time, consistently communicating the approach, so it just becomes part of the business philosophy. So I'm going to go through those key elements now. I'm going to try and show you how we can incorporate climate considerations all the way through. So most municipalities have done an asset management policy at this point in time, but you can always revisit it and take it back to council with a fresh face, or if you haven't done it, now's the perfect time. A policy typically includes a problem or issue statement. So I want to have sustainable infrastructure services for my community for today's generation and for future generations within the community. It normally lists the players that will be involved. So council will endorse, but public works and finance need to be involved in the charge here. It will list a course of actions you're going to take. You're going to develop some, key data sets and asset registry that everybody can use, and some key processes to move that asset management program forward. And then you're going to align it to organizational goals, the strategic plan, but other key directions of the organization as well. So just to add in the climate lens, that's the things on the right-hand side. When you define the problem, ensure that you talk about the organization's commitment to integrating climate change as well. Very simple. When you outline the players, include your sustainability staff. Very simple. When you outline the course of actions, mention the fact that you're going to integrate climate change adaptation all the way through. And then when you reference other objectives within the organization, make sure that in the policy you reference other plans, policies, or council directives that deal with climate consideration. So that's an easy start. And then moving forward, if you do that, developing your own asset management strategy, this is where you assess the current state where you're at. You get all the players at the table, whether it's your asset management steering committee, typically comprised of finance, public works, and the other asset owners, your facilities portfolio manager, your fleet portfolio manager, your emergency services, manager. Bring your environmental folks along and start to assess the current state by saying, what are we doing today in asset management? What are the gaps if we want to move to best practice? And how do we start to identify those gaps and close those gaps? But when you assess the current state, also discuss, have we done anything related to climate adaptation? And what do we need to address there to close those gaps as well? And with all the minds at the table, you'll start to identify a slew of initiatives. It must be a conversation with everybody involved. And then you start to define a practical, achievable future state for your municipality. And the key here is you probably want to review the best practices out there, but it doesn't mean you have to get to best practice. You want to look at what's an achievable state for us that takes us to the higher level of maturity, but they're feasible changes. And when you discuss it with everybody at the table, everybody is in consensus that it's the right things to do. And then ultimately, you'll develop a future path for yourselves with key initiatives and projects, with tasks and timelines that you've outlined over the next few years, but there's ownership of people within certain divisions or departments within the corporation, but all of the initiatives ultimately align to get you to that better future state. And you've also brought in that climate consideration piece as well, all the way through the process. So that's a great way to move forward. And just to give you an idea, how do you address those conversations? Well, when you get together in the committee, look at the key bullets on this slide. So talk about, from an asset management climate adaptation point of view, what strategy and planning documents are in place and which ones do we lack today? So, I mean, a good question I could ask you right now, and people might want to put in the chat, have you done a corporate climate adaptation plan? Have you done a community adaptation plan? But has anyone in the audience today done that industry-specific infrastructure adaptation plan? That's interesting to know. Organization and people, do you have the right roles and responsibilities together, even at the table, to bring your asset management program forward? Are you bringing in the environmental folks? Maybe someone could comment on that. That might be interesting. The next key things on the slide there: asset and data, asset management, decision-making, risk, levels of service, and I've also included financial management I'm going to talk about as we move forward. Asset data and information, it's the foundation of everything that will then allow the rest of your asset management program to flourish. Collecting the right data, having it structured in the right place is key. This slide talks about the asset data. We're going to talk about climate data as well. So for your transportation network, for your water, wastewater networks, for your facilities, etc., is your data centralized or is it still siloed in different departments? And how do you get that one version of truth together? It's really important everyone's using the same data. Is the data in your databases, is it an industry standard structure with the right categorization and the right hierarchy of assets below so that it's going to function for everybody who needs to use it? Moreover, is it consistently captured? Is it complete? Is your road network 90% complete today? Is it 50% complete in the database? And even if you're 100% complete, do you have good processes in place to maintain that currency of information as you move forward? One for the finance folks. So many asset management plans we see when it comes to costing and valuation data, the assets are still premised back on historical costs, and then someone's taken a CPI tables and they've inflated the cost to present day. But it's nothing more than an inflation of kind of a bad guesstimate from the past. So I would strongly suggest that for your asset inventory, get together with your engineering folks, talk about the true cost per unit replacement of different types of roads, items in facilities, water, wastewater systems, and extrapolate that cost per unit across all of the assets in the database. So there's true realism around your replacement costs, because that will drive your forecasts and your financial projections in your asset management plans. And it's so important to get the true story forward to council. Have you looked at how you share data between departments? One version of the truth is one thing, but is the data adequate? Is it able to share? Do you have the right reporting processes? What type of data gaps exist today for each of the asset classes? And one of the big ones is, do you have condition data? And if not, what's the process to capture that? And then finally, you may want some policies in place around the data governance and the maintenance piece going forward. So that was the approach we always looked at. And it's great for infrastructure data and getting all of the attributes against a water main. So we know it's a water main, it goes from this valve to this valve. We know it's got a certain material type, a diameter, etc. But what about the climate data that we need to look at as well? So there's lots of really good websites out there today. There's the Canadian Centre for Climate Studies, cccs.com, and you can get historical climate data for any local jurisdiction in Canada. There's great information. So you can find out for your city, town, region, what are the average temperatures typically? What's the average precipitation levels? And what are the typical water levels? And that's incredibly interesting and important if you're obviously on the ocean, or if you're near a lake or river bodies. You know, what are the historical levels, you know, that we're used to? And then also, as well as collecting that data, and, you know, what about extreme event analysis? So we meet with municipalities right across the country. I always ask, have you suffered from extreme weather events? Because the changing climate is twofold. It's a slow inception of a slow changing climate, but it's also bringing forward more weather variability and more extreme weather events. And I'm finding about 75% of municipalities we meet with have all had some form of extreme weather event, probably in the last 5, definitely within the last 10 years. So let's document those events, you know, and it's not that tough. Through a GIS map, you know, where did the event occur? And let's just put some polygons on the map so we know geographically what was the worst affected areas. And then we can also start to document what infrastructure was on those areas and which infrastructure types was the most susceptible to the impacts of those weather events, so that we can start to predict what may happen if those weather events happen again in the future. Incredibly important information. And what you'll find is if you talk to the frontline staff, they'll remember those days. Talk to your operations and maintenance folks. What happened on those days? You know, what did you have to do? What do you have to react to in the field? And they can give you a huge amount of information that you can track in a database against this. And you start to get a bit of a high level estimate on the overall cost of an event. And even if it's high level, that's good information to help you plan for the future, and also look at the cost of adaptation measures. And is the business case there to spend the money on adaptation rather than just waiting for the next event to happen? As well as that, future climate data. So we know what infrastructure is starting to be affected in different pockets geographically within the city, but how will that change as the climate changes? So the same websites can give you great projections on what is the projected temperatures for your area in Canada. What's the projected precipitation levels going to be as we move forward? And what about water levels? How are they going to change? And that will allow you to start to predict the future with a little bit more realism as well. And will things get worse? And can you do floodplain analysis? All kinds of good things over and above that, or just some high level analysis. And what's the likelihood for the reoccurrence of events and extreme weather events due to this? So some high-level analysis can really help you do the planning. One other thing on data, and it's become a trend, and actually BC is a leader on this trend. So, you know, kudos for BC. And a lot of the municipalities are starting to inventory natural and green infrastructure. It was actually started by Gibson's in BC. And so they said, well, as well as capturing the built environment, we should really get an inventory of our natural assets as well. So things like wetlands and forests and aquifers, all the things I have listed on the screen. And why do this? Because your natural assets often provide vital services. So a wetland may buffer the coastline, where there may be parks and trails right next to it. And it may actually do a better job than an engineered asset such as a seawall or a dike, and it may be more effective. And over time, it may be more resilient and adaptable to climate change. So we want to be careful as we move forward how we develop and how we maintain these valuable natural green infrastructure assets. And what better way than to inventory them and also give them some form of valuation. And that could be a whole other slideshow, but I just wanted to bring that into this. As we move forward, after you've got a good handle on your asset registry, you want to get some condition data from the field. You truly can't manage what you can't measure, and you can't project what needs to be done to the different asset types if you don't understand the condition of them today. So lots of ways to get condition data. Could be as simple as a field check or road patrol on the small assets like your culverts. When you get into larger roadways, bridges, water, wastewater systems, there's lots of industry standard assessment techniques to capture good information. And then the larger assets like trunk water mains, large bridges, treatment plants, you know, you want to get detailed engineering studies. But you want to look up for your asset types What's the cycle of capture? Is it every 2 years? Is it every 5 years? You know, and then what type of index or condition data are you capturing in the field that can also flow back to your asset registry database, so you can use that information to analyze going forward across the years. So that's really important. So if anyone wants to comment on how well they're doing in the condition assessment programs, feel free as well. That would be interesting to see. And then over and above, what about the climate change considerations? Well, I would say when you're doing these condition assessment programs today, they're somewhat costly to collect this data. Let's think about climate change considerations as well. So when you're out in the field, there's a couple of little things, but very key things you can capture that are really important as well. So you're out there capturing road condition information. What about capturing the location of that road? And due to its location, what is its exposure and what's its vulnerability to extreme weather events in the future? Is it right on the coast, for instance, or is it near a water body, or maybe a whole degree of other things? And you may have a scoring range to give it some criticality factor. And the other key things is, just score the infrastructure. What's its resilience to extreme weather events in the future? So the easy way to think about that is, if it's an underground system, is there a lot of additional capacity so it can take the strain? It's got inbuilt resilience to the next event, or has it got very limited capacity, whereas there's no inbuilt resilience to the next event? So you can score things like that as well. So don't just collect condition data, collect exposure, vulnerability, resilience. It could be 3 columns with a basic scoring framework, and any other functional and capacity related data that's important as well. So I'm going through a lot in a short space of time, but I hope this is painting a picture. Asset management, we always get into risk management. The reason why is you got good inventories on your assets, you understand the condition, the needs in the field will always outweigh the budget envelope you have to address things. So how do you prioritize what happens through your infrastructure projects and programs? It's good to come back to risk management. What truly needs to be done? So the definition of the international standard of risk, the ISO 31000, is it's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So it's a pretty high level statement. But in asset management, our objectives are to have sustainable infrastructure programs. And one of the big uncertainty is, when will the assets fail? What will be the consequence of their failure? But also, what is changing due to climate considerations? So I'll talk about that. So best practice in the infrastructure industry is the equation at the bottom. Risk from an infrastructure point of view is the probability of failure of an asset multiplied by the consequence of failure. So let's talk about that, and I'll bring in the climate lens on the slide afterwards. So typically, from an engineering point of view, we would say, what information in the database about this asset can help us quantify probability and the consequence of failure? So probability could be the consumed life of the asset. Even better, if I have up-to-date condition data, I'll use that to say it's already a poor condition asset. It's got a higher probability of failure than a good condition asset. Common sense stuff. What else will contribute to the failure going forward? Does it have, if it's a road, does it have a high average annual daily traffic flow? Does it have commercial traffic? Is it on a bus route? Etc., etc. And we can start to score the probability of failure. In the municipal world, consequence of failure is more important. So what about triple bottom line analysis? If this asset fails, what does it cost to replace it from an economic point of view? So a trunk water main has a much higher consequence of failure economically than a small diameter water main. But the other ones are even more important socially. If the asset fails in the business improvement district or in front of the hospital, that is a much higher consequence of failure than the asset that fails in a rural area of town. So the worst case scenario, the trunk water main that breaks in front of the hospital, shuts down the hospital, emergency vehicles can't come in, the road is flooded, and there's no water service to the hospital itself. So, councillors' phones are ringing off the hook. That's a high consequence of failure. And then how do we rank and rate environmental? So, if water mains break near water bodies, then the chlorine from the water main break will contaminate the environment. So that's another thing to look at as well. So that's how we typically do that, and we create a matrix. But how do we bring in the climate lens again so that we enhance this program? So I'm not an expert in climate assessment, but I talk to a lot of climate experts, and they use 4 major conceptual factors when they assess climate change impact and adaptation. So let's read these. So exposure, so that's the nature and degree to which a system is exposed to significant climate variations. I've highlighted the term system because let's change that. It could be biological, could be a social system. Let's change that for infrastructure system. So exposure, the nature and degree to which the transportation infrastructure system is exposed to significant climate variations. We can start to rank and rate that. Vulnerability, the degree to which the wastewater infrastructure distribution system is susceptible and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. We can start to use this. Resilience, the capacity of the system to absorb disturbance without losing essential function. And then finally, for your infrastructure systems, adjustments that have been made in response to actual or expected climate variations in the future. So have you changed operations and maintenance to help that adaptation? Because it could be quite a simple thing. Or do you have some capital projects, adaptation projects within the next 5 or 10-year window, which will lower the risk on that type of infrastructure? And then you can bring all of that together into the same equation. So risk equals the probability of failure, multiply the consequence of failure, different weighting factors across different attributes in your database. Now you say, I'm also going to score exposure and vulnerability because that will affect the probability of failure. And then on the consequence of failure is the inbuilt resilience. It may mitigate that consequence, or are there adaptation measures for the future, which will also mitigate the consequence. So I can change the score. And what you see on the slide is a lot of people have gone through this risk process. It's really well done. You end up with a heat map for each of your asset classes. So the 2 axes is hard to read. One is saying consequence of failure, the other saying likelihood of failure, and it goes from 1 to 5 from the bottom corner out. And the green quadrants are areas of low risk, and the red quadrants are areas of high risk. And this is a small network, but it's telling you the number of assets in each quadrant and the replacement value of each. So the red quadrants are actually saying, these are immediate concerns. You can use this to start to say, this should be in your capital program immediately. The green quadrants are saying, this is a problem for another day, continue to monitor. And then the areas in between are the most interesting. You can start to look at this for your long-range planning. How can I start to look at projects of like kind of nature? How do I bring them together into my contracts within the next 5-10 years so I get economies of scale and I mitigate risk in the right way? So risk is a great way to prioritize what you can do with limited funding and also bring in the climate lens. Lifecycle management. So I'll have to talk about some of these things quick. There's a lot to cover. Most asset management plans to date, especially when they're purely financial, they tend to say, there was an acquisition date of an asset. It has a useful life. It will be replaced at this point in the future. So we will forecast that's the replacement value of the asset will be added to our capital forecast. And then we accumulate them all, and that's how we do the forecast into the future. If the finance folks work together with the engineering folks, we get better life cycle management and better projections of the real money that will be spent on the asset, which is typically a lot less than just doing end-of-life replacement. So the idea on the graph is that when an asset's put into the field on day 1, it's in 100% good condition. It will deteriorate over time until, on this graph, 30 years later, so that could be a road. So the design life of the road is 30 years. But the public works engineering folks know that we do maintenance activities in the early days, then we move to preventative maintenance activities, then we move to rehabilitation activities, and we ultimately replace at the end of life. But the preventative maintenance may be crack sealing, for instance, and it may give the asset 3 years of added life. The rehabilitation may be a mill and pave or an asphalt overlay, and that may give 15 years of added life. And we may be able to do that twice before we actually have to fully replace the road. So we can actually extend the life of the asset from 30 years to about 60 years in reality by doing the right thing at the right time. And the overall costing envelope of all of the activities will be less than 2 rounds of replacement. So that's important. So you want to build lifecycle management into your asset management programming, and that's finance and engineering folks working together. Over and above that, how do we bring in the climate lens as well? So this is difficult. There needs to be a lot more analysis on this, but what we're finding is those life cycle activities, the engineers can't just stay within their own box. We got to say, will the estimated useful lifespan of the asset, does it need to be reduced because of this changing climate, the extreme weather events? Does the interval between treatments have to change? Maybe it's not the same as it used to be. More importantly, the types of materials used for our assets themselves and the materials used in treatments may change. The simple way to look at that is in southern Canada, the climate is slowly getting warmer and it's becoming more like the states that are just below us. So maybe we should look at how do they look after their road programs? What types of asphalt mixes are they using? What types of treatments are they using? Because they're the ones we should be using in the future, potentially. And then some assets will just need premature replacement and upgrading because they're just not fit to purpose anymore because of capacity issues on extreme weather events, that type of thing. So all of that will affect the life cycle model and total cost of ownership as we move forward. Finally, levels of service. Some people have tackled this and it's quite difficult, and some people take this as a very academic exercise, but I think you can start off very simple, and this works well. So balancing level of service between cost, performance, and risk is not a PSD citywide idea. This is an international best practice. It's in the ISO 55000 of asset management. So what they say is every asset has a value, and you can balance the value of the asset between cost, performance, and risk. But in the public sector, the value that an asset supplies is actually its level of service. So let's think of the transportation network. If we looked at the performance side of this, if your roads are in poor condition at all times, they've got a lot of cracks, they have a lot of potholes, the performance is very bad. The chances are there's not enough cost going into the program. And also because of that, the risk is very high to service failure and public safety. The opposite side of the coin is you have the best roads at all time. They're almost runway quality without a blemish. And because of that, there's probably an over expenditure on the tax burden to the roads. Maybe the money could get reallocated a little bit elsewhere, but the risk is very low. So you got to find the right balance for yourselves. And that's the simple way to explain levels of service. That could be a presentation unto itself. But the key thing is you can also bring in the climate lens here as well. So from the work you've done above, on the performance side, it's not just about condition. You brought in some capacity data. You brought in whether the assets have a higher exposure, to future climate events, more vulnerable. Do they have inbuilt resilience? And you start to quantify performance on a much holistic basis. Risk, you're not just looking at the risk of failure of the asset, it's the consequence of failure, but also attached to the climate factors as well. And then ultimately, you can look at the cost of what needs to be done into the future, which includes some form of adaptation measures. Some aren't the most costly, it may be operations and maintenance program based, and others could be quite costly, whereas you have to replace certain assets, full refurbishment, full replacement for adaptation measures as well. So with all that said, a nice way to present a dashboard to your senior management and through the council for level of service would just be to have a few metrics for any one of your asset classes based on cost, performance, and risk. Because you can wrap a lot of data into that, but you can communicate it in a fairly straightforward way the council will understand, and you can even take to the public in time. So this is just a for instance. There could be a lot more here, but for cost, what if you looked at the annual asset class reinvestment rate? So what do I mean by that? So there's industry standard reinvestment rates for different asset classes. So for the road network, it's a standard thing to say, if you took the entire replacement value of all of the roads in your community, you should put 4% of that value into your capital program on an annual basis. And that will allow you to refurbish and replace enough elements that you will have a sustainable condition rating all the time. And this particular municipality said that our target was approximately 4%. We are currently only doing a little over 2.2% today. So we definitely have an infrastructure gap. And that's a very easy way to look at the cost metric. On the performance metric, it's simple. We could just say we quantify the condition of all our assets. We can generate a pie chart that tells you the percentage of assets in very good, good, fair, poor, and very poor condition today. And then for the first time, you've gone through this risk framework and you've quantified and scored every asset with their risk score as well. This may be somewhat new for your council and for your, for your senior management, but you can say the percentage of the asset base that's in, very high, moderate, low, or low risk. And the key thing is you can track it year upon year. Are you getting better on condition, on performance? Are you getting better from a risk rating? Is it getting worse? And what's the level of service trends? So you bring everything together, and it includes the climate risk as well. So maybe someone might want to comment if they already done these types of levels of service models. That may be interesting in the chat as well. So with that, last couple of slides. So all of that would then get executed, and also it often comes back to finance. But finance in a perfect world are working well with all the line departments, the public works folks, and the environmental folks on this. And what you end up is you've got a financial strategy for your infrastructure that has true replacement costs. It ultimately, the perfect world, it has full life cycle cost of ownership. What is the true cost to maintain those assets into the future, including the climate adaptation pieces? And all of this gets approved in your short and long-term budgets. And moreover, it gets defined as part of your level of service target that you can take to council. That's what we're all trying to get to in asset management. It's a bit of a journey to get there. And that would get reported year upon year in your asset management plan and just continuously done through the asset management program. So covered a lot in the presentation. I'll finish up with this slide. There's a lot of good benefits that come forward from this process, and especially when you include the climate considerations. So I put down the word value off to the side. Assets should only exist to bring value to the organization. So asset management ensures that assets provide value to the organization and the community. Asset management will provide alignment. It's a clear line of sight and coordinated activities, because it's from council endorsement through senior management endorsement of key processes and practices, all the way through your budgets to the field activities. It ensures the leadership endorses things and they commit to the process all the way through. They back it. And there's an assurance of program development because you have a good framework in place, but that it will also get delivered. There's teeth to this. It's not just a plan with recommendations that never happen. And then finally, it ensures an effective and efficient management program across the organization. And sorry if I was a little bit rushed. There was a lot to go through. But with that, I'm happy to look at the chats and see if there's any key questions. And I'm also happy to take any questions at this time. So thank you very much. And if anyone does like to get in touch with me personally, I don't mind. I've actually added my own personal email address on the last slide here, so feel free. I would be happy to take further comments, questions as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks, John, for that great presentation. Certainly a major consideration and something that we as municipalities need to think about. And at this point in time, I'd certainly welcome anyone to pose questions through the question and answer feature on the app. And don't see any questions coming up quite yet. But maybe a question that I have for you, John, just to start things off, is certainly a lot of us have been very focused on built assets, and something that I've seen emerging over the past several years are natural assets. And so maybe just talk a little bit about what organizations are doing with regards to their natural assets, and maybe there's some organizations or municipalities that are maybe leading the charge on that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jim, for the question. Great question. I touched on it really quick in the slide deck because you can almost do a presentation on that into itself. But it did start with the town of Gibsons in BC. It was an interesting story. They said, let's inventory the natural capital assets because they play a role in the community and the sustainability of the community, and also sometimes better have better built-in resilience to climate adaptation, et cetera, et cetera. So they started a bit of a movement. From that came a not-for-profit association called MINAI. I believe you say it. It's MNAI. So you could look that up on the internet. They've done a lot of good case studies on how you would inventory natural capital assets. That's since been taken on by a few municipalities across the country. North Vancouver did some work in this area. Quite interesting. And then FCM got involved, Federation of Canadian Municipalities, to do a little bit of a study. I think there was 6 municipalities across the country in a case study. And they did a good job of taking it, not just the inventory of the natural capital assets, but also, what's the valuation of those natural capital assets as well. So in comparison to an engineered solution, if we looked at engineering a wetland as opposed to a natural capital asset, what's the value of that natural capital asset to the community? So, if you checked out MNAI, their website, you'd see a lot of good information on that. And this is only going to build in momentum across the country as time goes by, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thanks for that and for that website as well that we can turn to as a resource. Not seeing any questions coming up from the floor quite yet, but one other question that I have is just with regards to integrating climate change adaptation into our asset management plans. I think most municipalities are well on their way with regards to asset management, but the climate change adaptation is certainly something that's recently emerged. And how many have really gone down that path? And are there some other jurisdictions, either in Canada or maybe worldwide that we could maybe turn to as a best practice to consider?
Yeah, it's definitely somewhat in its infancy. A lot of municipalities have done climate adaptation plans at the corporate or community level that I was showing. But how many have brought it down to that industry-specific plan? And as I mentioned, there's a lot of frustration out there with environmental folks that they had great momentum in the early days while they did the corporate or community plan, but now they're lacking that leverage of getting projects and changes into short and long-term budgets through a better business process in an industry-specific plan. And that's why it's so key to tie it into your asset management process for infrastructure along all the steps I've shown. I'm only aware of a couple of municipalities that have actually gone down this path, and actually PSD have led a couple of municipalities down this path. In the UK, they're doing this a little bit more in many organizations. PSD actually partnered with the University of Oxford and their climate impact program that they have in place, and we roll out some of their processes in tandem with our asset management processes. But it's a fairly new thing. But there's absolutely a need for it, and it seems there's a big desire, especially with the environmental folks. Once again, how do we get down to that next level? So we're not just starting the discussion and awareness of what's happening and developing processes, but we're starting to get field level initiatives underway through our budgets, and we look forward to the momentum as this builds going forward.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks for that. So I know Rick Danluck was gracious enough in the chat. He did post the website there, so it's www.mnai.ca. And I know one of the questions that has come through the question and answer side is just with regards to that website. Would that bring up historical climate data based upon regions, or is there information that sort of data that's available? Maybe just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, that website's good for the natural capital assets. There's another website, CCCS, Canadian Centre of Climate Services, I believe, and it's fantastic. And it's run are a branch of the federal government, but they've got incredible data on any city, often to the city or town level, but definitely the regional level within Canada. And you can see historic climate information as well as forecasted future climate information. So for any municipality starting this program, it's a great starting point. You're going to get all kinds of insights from that particular website.
Okay. And can you just repeat that website again, John?
Yeah, it's cccs.ca, Canadian Centre for Climate Services, I believe. Pretty sure that's it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Oh, that's good. Well, we'll get that sort of up and posted on the chat or the Q&As just for people to be able to refer to. So, okay, no, that's really helpful. So, for many of us in municipalities, where I guess how do we get started with starting to introduce the whole aspect of the climate change adaptation into our organizations? What advice would you provide to us? Just to seems like a fairly almost an overwhelming undertaking. So any practical advice as to how do we get started?
Well, I kind of showed earlier in the slide deck an asset management strategy. We find that a lot of municipalities across Canada, they typically start the process with their asset management policy. You get that endorsed by council to start the charge on asset management, and then everyone kind of quickly jumps to the asset management plan. And a lot of folks miss that asset management strategy stage, which is part of best practice. So the asset management strategy is really that current state assessment. Where are you at today? How do you get to a higher level of maturity in your asset management program? What are the key gaps you're going to address? But looking at those key disciplines, as I showed within the slide, so you have an intelligent conversation with all of the players in the room. So I would say, if you haven't done a strategy, now is the perfect time to stop, do a current state assessment of your asset management program, but build the climate lens in all the way in that process, as I was shown within the slide deck. And even if you have done a strategy in the past, it's never a wrong time to update that strategy. And you need to bring all the right players to the table so you can have those conversations where everyone has a piece of, their discipline comes into play. So you've got the environmental folks there as well for the climate change aspect. That is probably the best approach. And because out of the strategy, you typically don't just get high-level recommendations, you get key initiatives that are going to address moving your asset management program to a higher level state of maturity, maybe across a 2 or a 3 year kind of roadmap. And it typically involves different initiatives that will be owned by different sections, departments within the municipality, but they're all aligned. They're all moving towards the same end goal. So it's a great way to really move things forward.
Okay, good. Thanks for that advice. So, just something that just sort of tweaked for me too is in terms of, very often each individual department, very much focused on, on their, their needs, their expertise and objectives. And as you bring more departments into this discussion, it certainly broadens that out. So, in your experience, have you found that there's some challenges with getting or gaining maybe a common vision and ensuring that the various departments work together? Because now we're moving from largely it's sort of a public works finance type of conversation to now bringing the environmental staff, maybe some of the emergency services staff, and what if any words of advice could you provide just in terms of how do you ensure that they all establish and achieve a common vision?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Jim. Asset management by definition is a team sport. There's multiple disciplines involved in asset management. You mentioned engineering, public works, finance. You got your fleet manager, you got your operations and maintenance folks, your facilities portfolio managers, and now we're seeing the environmental folks. So, there's a few different ways to do it, but one of the really good models I've seen across the country is because sometimes you have dedicated asset management staff, but they alone are not going to just complete the charge themselves. So you want to look at some form of steering committee where you have different folks from different departments involved, and you're going to meet, whether it's monthly, whether it's bi-monthly, and go through some of the key pieces, just like those key disciplines I showed within the asset management strategy slide, and how you move it forward in tandem and alignment with each one of those. So that's the key thing, is form this asset management strategy where everyone's aligned moving forward together. And the other key thing is it's very much a change management process. So bring change management processes and discipline into the works as you move things forward, and constantly communicate. I mean, in real estate, they say it's location, location, location. Asset management and climate adaptation is communication, communication, communication. And I mean, that would be my best advice on those two key things.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks for that. So just sort of building on that in terms of change management, I think, which is so true. Very often we very much focus on, I'll say, the technical aspects of any project, and often overlook the maybe the people side or the change management side. So any words of advice just with regards to how one can ensure that that we equip ourselves for the human side and the change management side of such a huge project.
Yeah, it's absolutely following a change management process. So the awareness of what we're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. You're gonna storm and norm and define that within your asset management steering committee, but then you've got to disseminate that information through your team meetings and across the organization. The awareness of what you're going to achieve is going to be endorsed, through your asset management policy. But then the desire, how do you move forward with the desire for the change, and why do you want to do this? And it's letting every group involved know what's in it for them. So your operations and maintenance staff, we don't need this. We've been doing this for the longest time. Well, are you struggling in the field with reactive programs instead of proactive programs? And are you getting that message across? And how do public works work better with finance? Because finance are the folks who are going to stand up in that council chamber and take your message to council. So it's building that desire by what's in it for them, and helping each stakeholder understand that they can get there and they'll get their message across. And then it's in ensuring that there's the right education. They have the right tools available to actually move forward, so they can start to implement that change, of course. And I'm almost going through the rule book of what a change management process is. Mm-hmm. We can talk quite lengthily about that, and then reviewing, where have we got to today, and have we made the right changes in the right places, and do we need to reflect on that again as a steering committee so that we start to move forward the next series of changes along the journey. So it's a never-ending journey. And that's probably the best advice I can give.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that, John. I see we're coming close to the end of our session. I know it wraps up at 2:00, and I believe that there's the next sessions do start at 2:00. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the session this afternoon. So, John, thank you so much for this incredibly insightful presentation, and all of the insights on the questions that were posed after your formal presentation. And with that, I think your contact information is available if people have further questions and want to reach out to you during the conference or subsequent to that. So with that, thanks so much, everyone, for attending the session this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.